They said, "Why do you still keep this old junk?" It didn't come as a question so much as a verdict, tossed out casually but meant to land. We were all gathered around the table, the kind of evening that was supposed to feel safe, food still warm, plates half filled, the easy hum of overlapping voices carrying the night along. I had been quiet, waiting for the right moment, the right pause, to bring out the thing I'd been holding on to. And when that pause finally came, I placed the old photo album on the table as though setting down a piece of myself. The leather was cracked in places, the corners softened by years of being lifted and put away again. It wasn't a perfect object. It was a living one, worn by time and fingertips. I hoped, that someone might recognize that. Maybe someone would see the way my hands lingered on it before opening the cover, as if I were about to let them into a private room of my life. The first page was simple. Sun-bleached faces, off-center smiles, and the kind of candid clumsiness only old cameras could produce. I had expected curiosity, maybe questions, the quiet, shared joy of recognizing people as they were long before now. But what came instead was a short, sharp laugh. "Look at that haircut," someone said, pointing to a picture where I stood younger, leaner, grinning without self-consciousness. A haircut that belonged to its time, worn without irony. Another voice joined in, poking fun at my clothes, bright patterns, mismatched colors, stubborn proof that once upon a time we all dressed for the day, not for photographs. It spread from there. Each photo was another opening for commentary. The way I held a drink in one picture became a joke about my serious face. The pose I struck in another became a chance for someone to stand up and imitate me. Even the furniture in the background, walls lined with a floral pattern that had been the pride of the house back then, was met with exaggerated groans. It wasn't vicious, not on the surface. No one raised their voice. No one cursed me. It was worse than that. It was easy, comfortable, a steady current of amusement at my expense that didn't need to be cruel because it didn't care enough to be. They weren't mocking me to hurt me. They were mocking me because they thought I was safe enough to mock, that I'd smile along, that I'd take it. And I did smile, because what else was there to do? My lips pulled into the polite shape that tells everyone you're fine. My fingers kept turning the pages, slow and careful, as though the album were fragile enough to break under the weight of anything but gentleness. Inside, I was thinking of the gap between what these photographs meant to me and what they had just become to everyone else, a stage for their easy humor. No one asked who had taken the pictures. No one asked about the days behind them, the moments that had led to the click of the shutter. No one asked how I had come to hold on to this collection all these years. The people in the photographs, some long gone, some still here, were invisible. All they saw were the surfaces, the clothes, the hair, the postures. They saw fashion mistakes. I saw my life. Still, I kept going. Not out of stubbornness, but because I knew. I knew what waited deep in those last pages. A single photograph I had never shown them. A photograph that didn't just hold a moment. It held a truth. And I didn't want to rush to it. I wanted to let them laugh. Let them think they'd read the whole story before I turned the page that would stop every word in their mouths. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was something quieter, deeper. Sometimes, the most powerful way to answer ridicule is not to argue, not to explain, but to let the truth speak for itself. And mine was waiting, black and white, grainy, undeniable, just a few pages away. Friends, let me take a short pause here. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened to you? If you haven't already, subscribe and share this video. This is how you help us grow this channel and keep bringing these stories to life. All right, let's continue. The album lay open between the plates and glasses, its pages becoming an uninvited stage. Every time I turned to a new photograph, it was met with a fresh ripple of commentary. Quick, careless, designed to make the room laugh. Someone leaned back in their chair, pushing their shoulders into a parody of my posture from a decades-old snapshot, their head tilted just so to match the angle in the picture. The laughter that followed was instant and unrestrained, not cruel in its tone, but cutting all the same. Another voice, sharper this time, picked at the colors in the old prints. "What even is that outfit?" they said, pointing to a shirt I'd worn on a summer day long before most of them were born. I remembered the weight of that shirt, the way it clung in the heat, the smell of cut grass in the air that day. But here, now, it was nothing more than an easy target, fabric reduced to a punchline. Someone else, quieter, but with that precise kind of tone meant to land, commented on the quality of the pictures themselves. Grainy, slightly blurred in places, the focus never quite perfect. I heard the words cheap camera, whispered like an afterthought, but one meant to be caught. They didn't know that camera had been a gift, bought with money my parents saved over months, wrapped in paper they couldn't really afford. They didn't know how carefully I'd held it, how I'd learned to coax light into it, how many moments I'd captured before I even knew how to frame them. Every remark was dressed in humor, but none of it was harmless. The sting came not from the accuracy of what they said, but from the complete absence of curiosity. No one asked why I stood like that in the photo, or what was happening outside the frame, or what that shirt had meant to me. The people and places in those images were living things to me, memory stitched into paper. But here they were reduced to props for an evening's entertainment. I found myself nodding, smiling where it seemed polite, keeping my voice quiet so as not to interrupt the rhythm of their jokes. But inside, there was a tightening, a slow coiling of something I didn't want to name yet. I had brought these pictures to share a piece of my life, and in return, they were stripping them down to curiosities, artifacts of another time they could safely laugh at because they didn't belong to it. And through it all, my fingers kept moving, page after page. It wasn't stubbornness, not entirely. It was the knowledge that every turn brought me closer to that one image buried at the back, a photograph that would stop all of this cold. They didn't know it yet, but I did. And with every careless laugh, every imitation, every whispered jab, I could feel the weight of that moment building. The picture wasn't just going to be seen, it was going to be felt. I kept my face arranged in the kind of smile that tells people you're fine, even when you're not. The kind of smile that buys you a little dignity by hiding the truth in plain sight. My fingers rested lightly on the edges of the album pages, but I could feel my grip tightening with each new laugh, each comment that skimmed across the surface of my life without once touching its depth. They didn't mean to be cruel, I told myself. That was the problem. It wasn't malice, it was indifference. My past, the years and moments that had shaped me, had become a collection of curiosities for them. Old haircuts, outdated shirts, furniture from another era. The world I had lived in was just a backdrop to their jokes, as if it had been staged for their amusement instead of lived in with my whole heart. Every photograph they laughed at had a story. The suit they mocked in one picture had been borrowed for a cousin's wedding, a day I'd worked 2 jobs to afford the gift we brought. The faded kitchen in another had been the heart of the house where my children learned to talk, where we'd measured their heights on the wall until the pencil marks reached over our heads. The awkward group photo they imitated, my arm slung stiffly over a friend's shoulder, was taken at a funeral, where smiles were an act of survival more than joy. But none of that was visible to them. None of it mattered. The worst part wasn't that they didn't know these stories. It was that they didn't seem to want to. They weren't looking for meaning. They were looking for a quick laugh, and once they'd found it, the photo had given them all it was worth. The image would close, the page would turn, and whatever was behind it would vanish. I realized then how quietly a person can be erased, not from the world, but from the value they once held in the eyes of others. You can still be here, sitting at the same table, your voice still heard when you speak, but your history reduced to decoration. Your presence becomes something ornamental, not essential. The album had been my attempt to build a bridge across years, to bring the past into the present so it could live again, even for just an evening. But instead of walking across it, they'd stopped to pick apart the boards. And as they laughed, I felt myself shrinking, as if the chair I sat in were pulling me backward, further and further from the table, until I was more observer than participant. I kept turning the pages anyway, my smile still in place, my voice still soft when I spoke. But inside, something else was happening. The more they laughed, the more I felt the weight of the photograph at the end, the one that wasn't funny, the one that would never be. And I began to understand that when I reached it, I wouldn't be showing them a picture. I'd be handing them a truth they couldn't turn into a joke. The pages turned slowly, each one heavier than the last. My hands moved with the same care they always had when handling the album, but now it wasn't reverence that slowed me, it was the weight of knowing what would follow. Every new image was like a small opening in my armor, and they knew exactly how to slip the knife in, not with cruelty sharpened to a point, but with that casual, effortless mockery that doesn't even realize it wounds. A vacation photo brought a jab about my tourist grin, exaggerated to get a bigger laugh. A candid shot in the backyard was met with a remark about the rusted swing set in the background, as if it had been some failure of mine to keep the world perfectly polished for a camera. A Christmas morning picture, one I had always loved for its unguarded joy, was reduced to commentary about the clutter around the tree, wrapping paper, opened boxes, and a room that had been full of more love than order. The album wasn't just a collection of photographs. It was a map of where I'd been, each picture a marker of something I had survived, or built or cherished. But in their hands, those markers meant nothing. They saw none of the work it had taken to stand in those frames, none of the quiet sacrifices that had made those moments possible. They saw only the surfaces, and even those they looked at sideways. I found myself wondering why I'd brought it out at all. Maybe I'd been foolish to think the past could be shared without being stripped of its meaning. I'd imagined leaning over these pages together, trading stories, filling the gaps between the photographs with words that made the images whole again. Instead, the gaps were filled with laughter that wasn't meant for me, and with the steady scrape of something precious being worn down. Still, I didn't close the cover. There was a stubbornness in me, one I couldn't quite name, that made me keep going. Maybe it was the knowledge that deep in these pages was something they couldn't touch, a moment so absolute that even their sharpest humor would dull against it. Or maybe it was because I needed to see this through, to let them exhaust their amusement before I showed them what waited at the end. I could feel my face tightening in ways I hoped they couldn't see. My smile had become a thin, deliberate thing, something I put on like a coat in cold weather. Inside, though, I was thinking of how easy it is for people to treat someone's history like a story they already know the ending to, and how quickly that illusion shatters when they're shown a chapter they didn't even know existed. So I turned another page, their voices still rising and falling around me. The photograph I was waiting for was getting closer, and with it, the moment when their laughter would stop, not because I demanded silence, but because truth, once revealed, has a way of taking the air out of a room all by itself. I was ready to close the album. My fingers hovered over the cover, the weight of the night pressing into my shoulders, making every breath feel like an effort. The room still buzzed with their laughter, but it no longer reached me. I'd been reduced to background noise in my own story, and the only thing left to do was retreat. Close the book, put it back on the shelf, and let it sink again into the quiet safety of being unseen. But then my gaze caught on something I hadn't meant to notice. There, at the very back of the album, hidden in the fold where the thick binding met the cover, was a slip of cream-colored paper. At first, I thought it might be a loose photograph, or a note I'd forgotten, but as my hand slid it free, I felt the distinct weight of it, an envelope, thick, sealed, untouched for years. The paper was aged now, the edges faintly yellowed, but the fold at the flap was still crisp. It had been placed here with care, by me, long ago, on a night when I'd decided it wasn't ready to be seen. I remembered that moment in perfect detail. The dim lamplight in my living room, the way I slid the photograph inside and pressed the glue down with the edge of my thumb. I'd told myself it was for safekeeping, that one day the right person, the right time, would come along, and then I would take it out. Until then, it would live here, untouched, shielded by the weight of the rest of the album. I hadn't expected to see it tonight. I hadn't wanted to. This evening was never supposed to be about anything serious, just a small act of sharing, a few laughs over the quirks of the past. But as the teasing had chipped away at me, as the photographs had been stripped of their meaning, I'd felt something building inside. And now, as I held this envelope, that feeling settled into certainty. The voices around me were still loud, light, thoughtless. But in my hands the air was heavy. I could feel the photograph inside without even opening it, the faint ridges where the image had been pressed into the paper, the slight give where the corners rested. And with that touch came the memory of the day it had been taken, the heat in the air, the smell of smoke, the sound of sirens that had seemed to come from every direction at once, the voice of someone calling my name, not in greeting, but in desperation. The weight in my arms that day wasn't paper, it was life. I thought about leaving it there, slipping it back into its hidden pocket, saving it for another time. Maybe one when the audience was softer, when the room was more willing to listen than to laugh. But that idea died almost as quickly as it came. This envelope had been waiting too long. It wasn't here to be kept safe, it was here to be opened. And I understood something then. They thought they had reached the end of my story tonight, that they had seen everything worth seeing and turned it into something they could joke about. But this envelope was proof that the story they'd been telling themselves was incomplete. It held a truth they couldn't rewrite, a moment they couldn't mock no matter how hard they tried. My fingers tightened around it, and for the first time all evening, I felt the balance of the room shift. Not because they noticed what I held, but because I knew what came next. I was going to open it, not for revenge, not for applause, but because sometimes the only way to silence a room is to give it the truth, raw and undeniable, and let it decide what to do with it. I held the envelope in my hands and felt the years press through the paper. It was more than just an object. It was a weight I had been carrying quietly, tucked away at the back of this album, the way you hide something not because you want to forget it, but because you know it will change the air when it's seen. I could remember exactly where I was when I placed it there. It had been late, the kind of late where the world outside was nothing but a stretch of still darkness, and the only sound was the steady tick of the clock in the next room. The house had felt different that night, emptier somehow, even though the walls were the same and the furniture hadn't moved. I remember sitting at the dining table, the photograph on the wood in front of me, and feeling my chest tighten just from looking at it. It wasn't the kind of picture you flipped past idly. It was the kind that stopped your hand mid-turn, the kind you needed to set down because your palms had started to sweat. That evening, I'd slid it into the envelope with a care I'd never given to any other photograph. I smoothed the flap closed, pressing the glue down as if sealing away something that needed to be protected, not just from damage, but from casual eyes. And then I'd taken this very album, flipped to the end, and slid it into the deep crease of the back pocket. Not in shame, not in fear, but in the quiet belief that someday it would be found by the person who needed to see it most. I didn't know then how long it would stay hidden. I didn't know that years would pass, that the weight of it would become a part of me the way an old scar becomes part of your skin, easy to forget until something brushes against it. Every time I opened the album in the years since, I'd feel its presence like a low hum at the edge of my awareness, but I never pulled it out. The right time never came, or maybe I never let it. Tonight, though, the weight in my hands was different, heavier, yes, but not because the paper had changed. It was heavier because the room had changed, because the air was thick with something it hadn't had when the evening began. Mockery, yes, but also that sharp edge of ignorance that only the truth can dull. I looked down at it and thought about the gap between what they believed they knew about me and what was actually there, folded neatly inside this envelope. They thought they had my story pinned down, a man with a few outdated photographs and a past worth teasing, but not worth respecting. They didn't know that inside here was the page they couldn't turn into a joke, no matter how quick their wit or sharp their tongue. I'd always told myself the envelope would reveal itself when it was ready. Maybe it was never about the right person finding it. Maybe it was about me being ready to let it go. And now, with their laughter still in the air and my hands wrapped around it like a lifeline, I realized I was. It didn't take long for someone to notice. The envelope wasn't loud in appearance, just plain cream paper, no markings, no names. But there was something about the way I held it that must have given it weight in their eyes. My fingers curled around it as if it might slip away. And in a room where everything else had been fair game for their commentary, this sudden change was like a crack in the surface. "What's that?" someone asked, their voice casual on the outside but laced with curiosity. It wasn't the kind of curiosity that cares about the answer. It was the kind that just wants to pull back the curtain to see if there's anything worth laughing at behind it. I gave the smallest shrug, my gaze still fixed on the envelope. "Just something I kept," I said, my tone light enough to pass as nothing, but not so light that it answered the question. It was the kind of response that invites more questions instead of ending them, and I knew it the moment the words left my mouth. Another voice joined in from the other end of the table. "From when?" There was a shift in their posture now. The easy lean of people settling into entertainment giving way to the lean forward of people sensing a reveal. Their laughter had begun to fade, replaced by the faint thrum of anticipation. I didn't answer right away. I ran my thumb along the edge of the flap, feeling the faint ridges where the glue had sealed itself so many years ago. It struck me how strange it was that this small fold of paper could hold not just a picture, but an entire moment in time, one that didn't belong to them yet, one they couldn't touch until I let them. The silence after my non-answer stretched, long enough for the air to feel different. This was no longer the easy banter of flipping through harmless snapshots. This was something else, an undercurrent, a quiet tension that began to pull the room toward me. Even the ones who had been laughing the loudest earlier were watching now, their eyes shifting between the envelope in my hands and my face, trying to read something they hadn't noticed before. "What is it?" someone finally pressed again, softer this time, as though the volume of the question might coax me into giving more. I lifted my eyes from the envelope and met theirs for just a moment. "A picture," I said simply, and then I let the pause linger. I didn't elaborate, didn't explain what kind of picture, when it was taken, or why it had been kept separate from all the others. My voice stayed calm, even, but inside I could feel the pressure building, not from their insistence, but from my own awareness of what I was holding. They didn't know it yet, but that thin piece of paper was the difference between their version of me and the truth. And the more they leaned in, the more I realized they weren't going to let it go. The curiosity in the room had shifted into something hungrier, and for the first time all evening, the laughter was gone. All that was left was the question, and the knowledge that the answer was going to change the night. The pressure didn't come all at once. It built like the slow tightening of a rope. A few voices at first, light and playful, telling me not to be so secretive. Then more joined in, their tones weaving together into something that felt less like curiosity and more like expectation. They wanted the reveal, and they wanted it now. "Come on, don't keep us guessing. Stop dragging it out." "What? Is it embarrassing?" The words were wrapped in humor, but I could feel the shift underneath. They weren't just joking anymore, they were circling. The same way they had circled the old photographs earlier, poking and prodding until there was nothing left but the surface they could laugh at. Only this time the envelope was different. They didn't know what was inside, and that ignorance made them restless. I kept my eyes on the flap, running my thumb along its seam, like I was smoothing the wrinkles out of my own hesitation. I could feel their attention pulling at me from every direction, filling the space between us. My breathing slowed, deepened. I had waited years for the right moment, but I'd always imagined it would arrive quietly, in a place of understanding. Not here, not under these lights, not with their voices pressing against me. And yet, there was a certainty settling in my chest now, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't rush, doesn't fight to be heard. It simply knows. This was the moment, not because they had earned it, not because I owed them, but because the truth locked inside this envelope wasn't meant to live hidden forever, especially not in the shadow of the laughter they'd thrown over the rest of my life tonight. The noise around me grew, a mix of goading and teasing, the same easy confidence of people who believe the story is still theirs to direct. But the more they spoke, the less it mattered. I wasn't feeling their push anymore. I was feeling the pull of the photograph itself. The weight of the day it was taken. The air thick with smoke. The sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. That moment had never needed their permission to exist, and it didn't need it now to be seen. I straightened in my chair, the envelope steady in my hand. The room seemed to quiet, not because they'd stopped talking, but because I had stopped hearing them. All I could hear was the memory, clear and insistent, the one I had been carrying for so long. When I looked up, I saw the expectation in their eyes, still playful on the edges, but with that spark of anticipation they couldn't hide. They thought they were about to be entertained. They didn't understand that what they were about to see was not entertainment at all. It was the piece of the story that changes the rest of the story. And as I slid my finger under the flap, I knew there was no going back. The paper gave way with a soft tear, the sound impossibly loud against the hum of the room. My fingers moved carefully, almost reverently, sliding the photograph out as though it could still break, even after all these years. It was lighter than I remembered, smooth from decades of being pressed flat, the faint scent of old paper rising as I brought it into the light. Only one picture, black and white, the kind of image that doesn't just capture a moment. It traps it, holding the weight of it forever between its edges. The contrast was stark, the dark shapes of smoke curling up from the corner of the frame, the pale blur of a child's face nestled against my chest, my own arms wrapped around them with the kind of grip that knows letting go is not an option. My shirt was torn, my hair plastered to my forehead, my eyes fixed on something beyond the lens, on the door I'd just come through, carrying more than my own life. I didn't need to say a word. The room went quiet on its own. The shift was immediate, the laughter collapsing into silence as quickly as if someone had taken the air out of it. Chairs stopped creaking. Glasses were set down. Even the shuffling of feet under the table ceased. The photograph didn't need explaining. Anyone who looked at it could see the heat of that day, the chaos surrounding it, the way my entire body was bent toward the small figure I carried. It was a picture taken not to commemorate, but to prove, to show that it had happened, that there had been fire and fear and a moment where everything could have gone another way, but didn't. I glanced up and saw their faces change as they took it in. The same mouths that had been quick with jokes only moments ago were pressed into stillness. The same eyes that had scanned old pictures for something to mock were now caught, held, unable to look away. The photograph stripped the night of its easy humor and left it bare. They didn't need me to tell them who the child was. They knew. They didn't need me to tell them that the picture had been taken seconds after we got out, that my arms had gone numb from holding them so tightly, that the smoke had burned my throat for days after. All of that was there in the image, in the way my hands were clenched around that small frame, in the way my own face seemed carved out of both terror and relief. It wasn't pride I felt as I let the silence stretch. It was something deeper, heavier. This was the moment the envelope had been waiting for, not for applause, not for recognition, but for the truth to be seen without me having to speak it. And in that stillness, I realized the photograph had done something I never could with words. It had made them see me, really see me, without the filter of their laughter. The picture lay between us now, its presence louder than anything they could have said, and for the first time all evening, no one was smiling. The silence wasn't the empty kind. It was thick, like the air after a lightning strike, when the world is still deciding whether to breathe again. The photograph lay on the table between the plates and half-filled glasses, the black and white shapes cutting through the warm colors of the room. In it, I was seated on the cracked pavement, my back hunched, my body curled around the small weight in my arms. My knees were drawn in, my head bent low, every inch of me bent toward protecting what I carried. And that child, small, fragile, pressed against my chest, wasn't just anyone. They were here, in this room, sitting at the same table, their face older now, unmarked by the soot and tears that streaked it in the picture. Their hands were still, resting on the table as if moving them might disturb the scene frozen in front of them. I hadn't planned to look at them, but my eyes found theirs anyway. There was a flicker there, almost imperceptible, recognition fighting with disbelief, as though the photograph had just unlocked a door in their memory they didn't know was there. I could see them taking it in piece by piece. The scorched edge of my shirt sleeve, the dirt on my knees, the tension in my grip. And maybe, just maybe, they were remembering the way my heartbeat must have sounded against their ear that day, or the way my voice must have trembled when I told them it was going to be okay. Around us, the rest of the table remained utterly still. The people who had been so quick to fill every pause with words now had none. The ones who had laughed the loudest were leaning back slightly, their eyes darting between the photograph and me, as if trying to reconcile the man in the picture with the one sitting across from them now. For me, the seconds stretched. I could feel the ache in my chest from that day, as if it had only just happened, the smoke in my lungs, the burn in my arms, the way the world narrowed to nothing but the fragile body I refused to let go of. That photograph wasn't just proof of an event. It was proof of a moment when everything I was, everything I had, was given without hesitation. And now, years later, here it was, dropped like a stone into the middle of a room that had been full of careless laughter minutes ago. The ripples were still spreading. I could see it in their faces, in the way no one dared to break the quiet, as if speaking would mean admitting they had seen something they couldn't unsee. I didn't rush to fill the space. The silence was doing the work. It was pulling the weight of the truth into every corner of the room, making it impossible for anyone to look at me, or at the child now grown, without seeing the thread between that day and this one. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep into my bones, that no matter what happened after tonight, they would never be able to turn that page in their minds and laugh again. I let the quiet breathe for a moment longer, feeling the photograph's weight stretch through the air. Then I spoke, not loudly, not for drama, but with the kind of voice that knows it doesn't need to compete with anything else in the room. That was the day the house caught fire, I said, my eyes on the image rather than on them, the day I carried them out. The words felt heavier than they sounded. I could see the flickers of movement around the table, slight shifts in posture, the narrowing of eyes, the kind of stillness that comes when a room leans in without realizing it. I tapped the edge of the photo with my fingertip, tracing the curve of my own shoulder in the image, the smoke curling above us. They were unconscious when I found them, I continued. The heat had already swallowed most of the upstairs. I didn't think. There wasn't time to think. I just ran in. The air burned going down my throat. Every step felt like carrying a weight that doubled with each breath. I could still feel the sting of that heat against my skin, the desperate thud of my heart in my ears. When I got outside, I didn't put them down, not right away. I remember sitting there on the ground, not believing it was over until I felt their chest move against mine. The image in my memory was so vivid I could almost smell the smoke again, hear the frantic shouts in the distance, the wail of sirens growing closer. My arms ached as I spoke, phantom muscles remembering the strain of holding on too tightly, afraid that letting go for even a second might undo what I had just done. I glanced across the table to the person in the photograph, older now, but carrying a stillness in their expression that told me they were somewhere else entirely, maybe hearing the story in a way they'd never heard it before. Their eyes didn't leave the picture. It was as if they were looking at themselves through a window, finally seeing the moment they had only known as a gap in their own memory. Around us, the others stayed quiet. No one interrupted, no one joked. The laughter that had been so easy earlier seemed like it belonged to a different night, a different group of people. Even the clink of utensils and glasses had stopped. I never showed this to anyone, I added, my voice lower now. Not because I wanted it hidden, but because I didn't need to be thanked. I kept it because some things are worth remembering even when you can't talk about them. The photograph lay flat between us, but it might as well have been a line drawn across the table, a before and after. On one side, the version of me they thought they knew. On the other, the truth that no one could unsee now that it had been placed in front of them. I had kept that photograph hidden for years, not out of shame, but because I understood the weight it carried. Some moments are too sacred to be pulled out casually, too bound to the rawness of what they cost to survive the flattening that happens when they become conversation pieces. I didn't want it passed around like a curiosity, held by hands that didn't know the heat of that day, the sound of the beams groaning above me, the desperate rush to get out before the ceiling came down. It wasn't about being modest. It was about keeping something intact. The moment captured in that image was not just a story. It was a line in my life that divided everything into before and after. Before, when the day had been ordinary, when I'd thought I had all the time in the world. After, when I'd learned that time is a liar, that everything can be taken in minutes, and that sometimes you run toward the danger instead of away from it because someone else's life depends on it. I had imagined what might happen if I ever showed it, the easy questions, the reflexive thank you that's more about the person saying it than the one receiving it, the way gratitude sometimes turns into debt, and debt turns into discomfort, and before long the truth is dulled by the weight of awkwardness. I didn't want that for them, and I didn't want it for me. The rescue had been something pure, done without thought of what it might mean later. The photograph was my way of keeping that purity untouched. But as I sat there now, the black and white image lying between us like a truth neither of us could step around, I realized I hadn't just been protecting the moment from them. I had been protecting myself from having to relive it in their presence, from watching them shrink it down into a story they could file away with the rest of my life in this album, worthy of a glance, but not of silence. The child in that picture, grown now, breathing, alive, was the only reason I could look at it without breaking. But even now, seeing it on the table, I could feel the heat on my skin again, the sting of smoke in my throat, the way my body had moved on instinct alone. It was unbearable to remember and yet impossible to forget. I had never wanted this photograph to be proof for anyone else. Proof is for people who doubt, and no one had ever questioned that I would do anything for the ones I love. But maybe I had kept it for a different reason, so that on nights like this, when my history was turned into a series of punchlines, I could put something down on the table that no one could laugh at. Something that reminded them that the man in these pages wasn't just a figure in faded colors and old clothes. He was the one who carried someone out of a burning house and didn't let go until they were safe. And now finally they knew. It was almost by accident that my eyes found his. He sat halfway down the table, slouched back in his chair like a man who had been in control of the room all night. And in a way he had been. He was the one who'd started the laughter earlier, the one who could turn a single glance at an old photo into a performance, the one whose voice had been the loudest in mocking the way I'd stood, smiled, dressed. He had been quick with his tongue, comfortable in the role of entertainer, the easy ringleader of a crowd that wanted something to laugh at. But now his body told a different story. He wasn't leaning back anymore. He was leaning forward, elbows resting on the table, hands folded loosely in front of him, his shoulders curved inward, not in shame exactly, but in that unconscious way a person folds in on themselves when they feel smaller than they did a moment ago. And his eyes, those quick, darting eyes that had scanned the album for material, were still, fixed. He was staring at the photograph as though it had taken him hostage. His gaze didn't skim over it or wander to the details in the background like it had with the other pictures. It was anchored, held by something deeper than curiosity. I could see him tracing it slowly, absorbing the sharp contrasts of the black and white image, the smoke curling upward like dark fingers, the tension in my arms as I held the child, the way my whole body seemed to be wrapped around theirs like a shield. His eyes lingered on the dirt, and ash streaked across my face, on the torn fabric of my shirt, on the way my head bent toward the small figure in my arms. It wasn't confusion I saw in him, it was recognition. Not of the day or the details, he hadn't been there, but of the truth the picture carried, the truth that this moment had not been posed, not been planned, not been for show. It was survival. It was urgency. It was love stripped of all the easy, polished shapes we usually give it and left raw, desperate, and real. The rest of the room seemed far away. Voices were hushed now, if they spoke at all. Forks lay forgotten on plates, hands rested still on laps or tabletops. But between him and me, the air felt almost solid. He kept looking, his eyes moving over the photograph like he was trying to memorize it. Like he needed to take in every detail so that later, when this night replayed in his mind, he wouldn't be able to soften it, wouldn't be able to tell himself it wasn't as heavy as it looked. When his gaze finally lifted from the photograph and met mine, I saw it, that shift. The cleverness was gone. The rehearsed grin, the sly tilt of his head, the readiness to turn anything into a joke, all gone. In their place was a heaviness I recognized too well, the awareness of having been wrong. Not just mistaken, but wrong in a way that mattered. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes told the whole story. How he'd come into this evening thinking he knew who I was, thinking my life was nothing but faded images in a leather-bound book, easy to pick apart. And how, now, that story had changed. There was no way to unsee what he'd seen, no way to unhear the silence it had brought. It wasn't an apology, not yet. But it was the step before an apology, the loosening of pride, the first crack in the armor, the opening through which understanding can finally enter. And I knew in that moment that even if the rest of the table forgot, he wouldn't. He'd carry this image with him, and every time he thought of me, this would be what rose to the surface. Not the poses, not the clothes, not the old wallpaper in the background of other pictures. Just this. A man on the ground holding onto a child like nothing else in the world mattered more. The photograph still lay on the table, but it no longer felt like paper and ink. It felt like a stone dropped into the center of us all, sending ripples through the air that no one dared disturb. The laughter, which had once moved so easily from one end of the table to the other, was gone. Not faded. Gone. It had left without warning, as if it had been something fragile that couldn't survive in the same room as the truth. No one reached for another page of the album. The plates and glasses in front of us seemed suddenly louder in their stillness, untouched. Even the soft clinking of cutlery, the casual rhythm of a family meal, had stopped. The air was heavier now, thicker, as though someone had turned down the oxygen, and we were all breathing the same awareness. I could feel their eyes on me, but not in the same way as before. Earlier, their glances had skimmed over me the way water runs over stone, quick, dismissive without thought. Now, when they looked, it was slower, careful. Some faces were tense, their brows pulled tight as if holding back words they couldn't yet form. Others avoided my gaze altogether, staring at their own hands, their plates, the folds of the tablecloth, as though afraid that if they looked too long at me or the photograph, they would have to confront something they weren't ready for. It was the silence that spoke loudest. It wasn't awkward. Awkwardness is shallow, a skin-level discomfort that passes quickly. This was deeper. This was the kind of quiet that comes when a truth has landed and everyone feels its weight pressing down, making movement harder, making words dangerous. A collective understanding had settled here, unspoken but undeniable. They had crossed a line without knowing it, and the line would not be in the same place ever again. I didn't rush to speak, to make the moment easier for them. Part of me wanted to let them sit in it, to feel just a fraction of the stillness I had carried for years with that photograph hidden away. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't about a single picture. It was about the years of my life that could not be reduced to entertainment. Even the one who had laughed the loudest earlier sat back now, his hands clasped together, his eyes distant. The child from the photograph, now grown, sat perfectly still, their fingers resting lightly on the table as if they weren't sure whether to reach for the image or leave it untouched. I wondered if they could hear the echo of my heartbeat from that day, the way I still could, pulsing under my ribs like a second life. The room had changed. Not physically, the same chairs, the same plates, the same fading light from the chandelier above. But in the way a room changes when everyone inside it has seen something they can't unsee. The easy warmth from before was gone. What replaced it wasn't coldness exactly, but a sober kind of clarity. A mutual unspoken admission that the man they thought they knew was more than the figure in their jokes. And in that silence, I realized something. I didn't need their apologies. This moment was its own reckoning, quiet and complete. The truth had already done the work. I let the silence breathe a little longer before moving. My hand rested on the open page for a moment, my fingers brushing the edge of the photograph as though I were sealing it back into place, not to hide it again, but to honor the moment it had finally been seen. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I closed the cover. The faint thud of the album shutting seemed to echo louder than the laughter from earlier in the evening, as if the sound carried the weight of everything that had shifted between us tonight. The leather felt different under my palm now. Before, it had been just a container for scraps of memory, birthdays, holidays, ordinary afternoons, frozen in fading color and worn edges, but now it was something else entirely. It wasn't just my past anymore. It had become a witness, a record of truths that no one in this room could pretend not to know. The photograph inside wasn't going anywhere. They could ignore it, try to bury it under the comfort of old habits. But the image would be waiting, inside the album and inside their minds. It was no longer just mine to carry. It now belonged to everyone who had sat here tonight and seen it. I placed the album back on the table, not pushing it away, but leaving it where it could still be reached. I wanted them to know I wasn't taking it back to the safety of a drawer or a shelf. The story was out now, and it had a place in the open. My hand lingered on the cover, not as a claim, but as a reminder. These pages weren't made to be mocked. They were pieces of a life, my life, each one holding a fragment of truth that deserved to be seen for what it was. No one spoke. There were no awkward attempts to lighten the mood, no hurried changes of subject. Even the shifting of chairs was slow, careful, as though the air itself might shatter if disturbed too suddenly. The album sat there like a quiet center of gravity, pulling all of us toward the knowledge we now shared. I looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. Some glanced away quickly, unable to hold my gaze. Others met it fully, the way you look at someone after you've seen a part of them you didn't expect, something that changes the shape of the story you've told yourself about who they are. The child from the photograph, now grown, still hadn't moved their hand from the table. Their fingers tapped lightly once, almost like they were marking the rhythm of their own heartbeat, before they looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite name, something between gratitude and the ache of understanding. I leaned back in my chair, not triumphant, not vindicated, but grounded in a way I hadn't felt in years. I didn't need to explain anything else. The album was no longer just a collection of images to them. It was a piece of living history, a truth too heavy to be discarded or replaced. They could never flip through its pages again without remembering this night, without feeling that moment when the laughter stopped and the room was forced to see what had always been there. And as I sat there, the closed album still within reach, I understood that something irreversible had happened. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about forcing them to admit they'd been wrong. It was about knowing that the truth, once shown, can't be unseen. And this truth, my truth, was now bound into those pages forever. Impossible to erase from their memories. Impossible to return to what it had been before.